So hello and welcome everyone to our first Australia Institute Policy School. My name's Alice Grundy and I will be your host. I'm coming to you today from beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Sovereignty has never been ceded here. It always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. So this is the first class of Policy School, our fortnightly series. Each session you will hear from policy experts from the Australia Institute who will take you through the most important policy issues, including fair tax, electoral reform, the Australia-US relationship, the housing crisis, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You'll learn about key issues in the current policy landscape, barriers to reforming policy, the most persuasive arguments and key messages, and very importantly, how to communicate cut-through facts and data to help you change minds. That's the business that we're in at the Australia Institute, changing minds. At the end of Policy School, you'll be able to confidently advocate for what needs to be done, explain why it needs to be done, and how we can all work together to achieve a more just, sustainable, and peaceful society. So a few reminders at the beginning. You can type in questions for our panelists using the Q&A box. You can upvote other people's questions too, and you can ask questions at any time. You don't just have to type them out at the end. If there's a term that you'd like some more detail on, if there's something you're curious about, go ahead and ask the question. And we also have the chat, so remember to keep things civil and on topic in the chat, otherwise I'll be kicking you out. And finally, this is a live event and is being recorded. The video will be available on our website at australiainstitute.org.au, and we'll share a handy 2-page summary along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides by email with the attendees. So in this, our very first episode, we have Australia Institute and Centre for Future Work Chief Economist, Greg Jericho. You may also know him as a prolific tweeter, Grog's Gamut on X. I should also say insightful, not just prolific. Greg writes a weekly column on economics and politics for Guardian Australia, a position he has held since 2013. So who better to talk to us about revenue? Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Alice, and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to the Policy School, the first Policy School. We're going to be having one every fortnight and certainly until the end of the year, and then we'll probably be starting again. We haven't fully worked out, but probably around just after Australia Day. So it really is hopefully a really insightful and informative school. And I just wanted to sort of point out what we're all going to be doing over the next few weeks and months. These are not so much like some of our webinars and podcasts that we do where we are almost just explaining the facts and giving a bit of pushback on some of the myths. It's a really important thing, but this is actually hopefully doing a bit more, something that will enable you, provide you with the tools of how you can advocate for better policies, whether that is because you're working in a social organization or an NGO and you really want to have some tools that you can really work with, whether you are thinking of running for office yourself at some level, or whether you just want something that you can confront your local MP or send something to journalists or to the media, or if you happen to be on Q&A, things that you can actually push for and do more than just, oh, that fact is wrong. Now, I'm going to disappear for a little bit because I'm going to bring up some slides. I'll come back every now and then, but hopefully you're not going to be too put off by just looking at a screen all the time. We'll pop back in. But I just want to point out as well as we start, one of the key things with this school is, as I say, it's not just about presenting facts and saying, oh, that's done. Alas, and I say this as someone who loves graphs and who is going to show you quite a few graphs, a graph alone won't do it. If that was the case, then, climate change would have been solved well before now, because we've been seeing this type of graph for a good 20 years now, and it's really good, makes us feel good, but it doesn't actually do much. When we're talking here about the policy school, it's actually about how to win policy. And I like to think of it as it's kind of a 3-step process. You need to highlight the issue. You do need to show something like that graph of rising temperatures, because you need to get that information, understand the facts out there. They need to be clear because there are a lot of myths and a lot of misinformation going out there. But that's not the same as that second point, which we'll get to, of explaining the problem. I can say that that temperatures have risen over a degree over the past decade, and people will go, okay, is that good? Is that bad? It means it's a bit warmer. Why is that bad? Why is that a problem? Same, we could say, oh, inequality is rising. Okay, is that a problem? Why is that a problem? We need to explain the problem and not just assume we can put up a graph and show, oh, inequality's risen or climate change is real, and people go, oh, I understand that. But it's not just about to say, oh, it's a problem. It's a case of, okay, does that mean we can't fix it? We need to be able to provide a solution. And we need to be able to provide a solution because that's something we can advocate for. That's something also we can, in a sense, put in front of politicians and say, this is actually a way to fix this problem. These are things you can do. These are things we can push for. Now, as I go through it, I'll be sort of going through these first steps. So let's get straight on into it. Let's highlight the issue of what we're talking about today. And the issue is that Australia is a low taxing country. And you might think, okay, why is this an issue? And again, it's an issue because the main myth, and you can see this from the headlines that we see quite often, is that Australians pay a lot of tax. Apparently, we pay a lot of our wages in tax, and that the government is spending too much. We got a spending problem. We got to cut back on spending. Spending is causing inflation to rise. It's putting us into debt. It means that the budget deficit is growing. And always remember here, and I'll try and explain terms as I go along. Remember, the budget deficit is just that the government has spent more than the amount of tax and revenue it has raised. Or to put it another way, and I'll explain why this is important later, we could say the government is raising less revenue than it is spending. It's a difference of inflection. It's a difference of where you put the emphasis. But essentially here, the issue is Australia is a low taxing country. So we need to explain that. So I'm going to use a graph here. This is from the OECD. The OECD are basically all the 38 most advanced economies in the world. A lot of countries in Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. Most of the big sort of advanced economies, mostly stable democracies, kind of the richest countries. Across all of those 38 countries, the average amount of revenue that is raised each year is equivalent to about 35% of their GDP. GDP is basically how much do they produce each year in their economies, and on average about 35% of that is how much is raised in tax. Australia, it's actually below 30%. Now, I know these are kind of figures that you look at and it all gets a bit confusing. Don't worry. I'll explain what it all means a bit later. But essentially, this is just an absolute fact. We are below average tax raising country. The only countries that raise less than us are USA, and that's just below us. Switzerland, well known for putting your money in if you don't want to pay tax. And then nations like Costa Rica, Colombia, Chile, Turkey, and Mexico, which are generally along the poorer of these nations in the OECD. And then we've also got Ireland, which is a bit of an anomaly because Ireland, what people might realize, has actually become a massive tax haven for companies. Companies like Apple and Google, they can just notionally say they're in Ireland. The money just flows straight in, straight out, doesn't touch the sides, but it kind of makes them look like they've got a big GDP. And it's so bad that actually people kind of ignore Ireland as their GDP. So low taxing nation, but let's compare us to, you talk about OECD average, that's kind of meaningless. So let's talk about some countries. Basically, we're well below New Zealand and Canada, who are right on the OECD average. We tax less than Japan does, not exactly a communist known country. We tax less than the UK, and of course, we tax much less than Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, those Nordic countries that you always hear. Certainly at the Australian Street, we like to talk about, but you have other people, those who think that tax is bad, saying, oh, we don't want to be like those socialist countries, the Nordics. So you look at all of that across, thinking of nations like New Zealand and Canada that certainly Australia feels very sort of much at home with, they tax a lot more than us. Now, I want to sort of also put in just a little bit that the issue as well is not just that we're a low taxing nation, that we're a rich country. Okay. We are one of the richest countries in the world. And certainly among the OECD, there's not many that are among us. We are above average rich. We are really quite wealthy. So when I sort of suggest that, that's kind of the issue, and I'll just come back here, that's essentially the two things that we're trying to get across. We're a rich country, great, and we're a low taxing country. And if we just left it there and we say, "Oh, this is the issue," we've defeated the argument. It's like, well, probably not, because we haven't actually outlined the problem. Because people might go, "Oh, isn't it good that we're a low taxing country? It seems good that we're rich. How is that a problem?" You need to explain the problem. It's not enough just to go, you said we're a high taxing nation. We're not. Here's my graph. I'm right. Being right is not actually how you win at policy. You need to explain things. You need to actually persuade. So let's try and explain the problem. The problem is we are a rich nation, but with high levels of poverty. These two graphs have the poverty rates for people aged over 51. Across the OECD, across those extremely rich countries, we're again well above average in the poverty levels for people aged 51 to 65. The only, and I said, we're a rich nation, the only nation that is richer than us that has a higher level of poverty for people aged 51 to 65 is the USA. And for people, the poverty rate for people aged over 65, no richer country has higher poverty levels than we do. So we're an abnormally rich nation with an abnormally high degree of poverty. That is a problem. We're a rich country with a lot of poor people and a lot of people really struggling. Remember, poverty, this is a case where you are struggling actually to get by on a day-to-day basis. And we have an abnormally high level of that. That's a problem. The other problem is we actually spend little on things that reduce poverty. So what we've got here are what we call the replacement rates for the unemployment benefits, so for job seeker and for the age pension. Economists use replacement rates because you'll often see in, say, the Financial Review or the Australian or others say, "Oh, job seeker is the highest, one of the highest in the world when you look at it in US dollars." And it's like, yeah, that might be true, but that's because things cost more here in US dollars as well than they do other places. It's no great wonder for people on unemployment to be told that their unemployment benefit in US dollars is more than people in Poland get, because they're not buying things in Poland, they're buying things in Australia. So what we look at is the replacement wage, in effect. What is the level of unemployment and what is the level of the age pension compared to the average wage? That enables us to compare apples with apples. And Australia comes dead last for unemployment assistance. In a sense, saying if you were able to pick where you could be unemployed in anywhere in these advanced economies, the last place you'd pick is Australia. That's where it's toughest. Good news is for age pension, it's not the worst. The bad news is it's the second worst. And I've got replacement rate for men there. That's because the OECD does replacement rates for the pension by men and women. I could have done women as well. They come second last as well. So, but the thing is, we know what happened during the pandemic when Scott Morrison effectively doubled the rate of the age of the unemployment assistance. Poverty plummeted, because here's a little sort of secret about reducing poverty. You give people with poverty more money, more assistance, they're lifted out of poverty. But we spend little on that. So it's no surprise that we're a rich country with high levels of poverty when we're actually not paying people on the pension and unemployment assistance a lot. In fact, we're very low spending. And the reason why I use 51 and above is we know about a third of people on jobs seeker on the unemployment benefits are over 50. So it's not a surprise when you look at those things. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is we actually need more government service. You think back to that first slide where I was sort of talking about, we've got a spending problem. The problem is we've got healthcare waiting lists. We've got public schools no longer being able to afford sports programs because they can't afford the trips, they can't afford the equipment. We've got Centrelink, Medicare waiting times. So I could put in clips about infrastructure. We have a multitude of services, of spending that is needed by government services. So what it really comes back to is, yes, we're a low taxing nation, but we don't actually have a spending problem. We don't need to reduce spending. We have a revenue problem. We need to raise revenue. Remember I said about that, and I'll just sort of, I'll just come back. Remember what I was saying. A budget deficit is a government spending more than it raises in revenue, or it's government's raising less than it's spending. If you raise the amount of revenue, you reduce your deficit. So,
And Greg,
yep,
we have a question here from Will Jones asking
yeah.
for you to define what you mean by tax. He asks, does this include all taxes and does it include royalties?
Yeah, it's royalties are generally included in the tax. I'm not 100% sure if they include it with this with the OECD. I'm pretty sure they are including it. This is essentially what we're looking at here is mostly capital taxes, income taxes, property taxes, GST, so taxes on consumption, and also taxes on wages in many other countries in the OECD that include what they call social security contributions, which sound really nice, but are actually compulsory repayments that come straight out of your wage. So it's a combination of all of those. It does also include things like state government revenue as well. So it's general government. This is not just federal government. It is that general government. I'm pretty sure it does include royalties. Unfortunately, if we in terms of royalties, it wouldn't actually move the dial too much when we're talking overall taxes, because they're a very small one. Major taxes that we're talking here are income tax. That's by far the biggest. Company tax as well are the biggest ones as well. But basically, I'm just using the straight OECD definition of what tax is. Does that sound fine? Yep, I'll move on from there. So what we've got here is I'll just come back to my slides because uh, sorry, I've lost my place. There we go. So the problem is we actually need not so much cut spending, it's about actually let's raising revenue. But now I'll come back to this first graph where we've got, 29.7% of GDP and 34.8% of GDP. If I was to say, oh, just go out and tell people that, I'd be one, an idiot, but also it'd be great, you'd be accurate, but people would have no idea what you mean. What the hell is a percent of GDP? It's kind of a meaningless sort of a number. So let's actually put a number to it. If we were just to raise the same amount of revenue across all governments that they do in, say, Canada, which is right on the OECD average, we would roughly raise an extra $140 billion a year more revenue. It's a smidge below it right now. By the time of the election, because our GDP would have grown, it'll actually be over 140 billion. So let's say 140 billion dollars in extra revenue. But even if I was to say that, go out and say, oh, if we just raise the same amount of money as they do in Canada, which we kind of have a nice affinity with and think, yeah, Canadians are just like us, their economies just like us, their democracies like us, they're all in the Commonwealth, same with New Zealand. If I say 140 billion, again, it's this, what is 140 billion? It can be a bit like Lucille Bluth on Arrested Development of, how much can a budget cost? 140 billion? It's meaningless. So let me sort of put some figures there. Age pension, 59 billion. NDIS, 44 billion. Job seeker, nearly 15 billion. Childcare subsidy, 13 billion. Housing, and this is from the federal government, so it's mainly their spending on social housing, 4.3 billion. Vocational ed, so that's government spending on things like TAFE, 2.4 billion. ABC and SBS, their ongoing funding each year, 1.4 billion. Add all that together, we got $140 billion. So essentially what I'm saying here is if we were just to raise the same amount of revenue as they do in Canada, we could double the age pension, double the spending on NDIS, double job seeker, double childcare subsidy, double the amount of spending we do on social housing, double the spending on TAFE, and double the budgets of ABC and SBS, and we wouldn't raise debt at all. The deficit wouldn't go up. Nothing would change on the budget, except we would be able to provide better services. We'd be able to lift people out of poverty who are on job seeker, on the age pension, help people on the NDIS, help people on childcare subsidies, which would encourage worker participation, provide more housing, better train our population, our young people, and people who are in industries needing a transition from net zero, and actually get a better ABC and SBS. That's kind of what we're talking about. It's a revenue problem because we need to actually have more government spending. We need to be able to do these things. So I've explained the problem. The problem is we don't have enough revenue. Giving you some numbers that you can play with, it's not enough just to say that. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Provide a solution. The problem is we need to actually start thinking about tax as good. And I've got here a graph, and I always hate using stratigraphs because they freak everyone out. So I've nicely sort of divided this one into quadrants. Essentially, again, this is those OECD countries, and you can see pretty clearly there is a nice link between countries that have less tax and having higher levels of poverty, and low tax, or sorry, more tax and lower poverty. Basically, half of the OECD nations down here in this bottom right quadrant raise more tax than us, and they have lower levels of poverty. Nations like UK, New Zealand, Germany, Austria, Canada, Norway, Netherlands, Sweden, France, Belgium, Finland, Slovenia, Czechia, all of those have more tax than us, less poverty. The only countries that have less tax and less poverty than us are Switzerland, again, tax dodging place, and Ireland, which has got really sort of wacky sort of GDP because it's just being used as a funnel for tax avoiding countries. And then you got countries that raise less tax than us, but actually have more poverty: Mexico, Chile, Costa Rica, Turkey, and the USA. It's really a case of what type of society do you want to live in, and the sense that actually more tax is linked with less poverty. But it's always this case of, if I sort of put that up and people feel good about that and think, oh, yes, we want to reduce poverty. But you also hear people going, oh, no, you're going to tax us into bankruptcy. You can't tax your way to prosperity. High taxing nations, that's not a way to be high income. Well, let's go back to that graph about us being a rich country. Most rich nations usually have high tax. I've taken out Luxembourg and Ireland because, again, Luxembourg is a bit of a tax dodge, and it's so small. It has a massively high GDP capita, and it's kind of ruins the scale. Ireland, again, is we can kind of ignore. Apart from those two, the only two nations that are richer than us that raise less tax, and actually Luxembourg raises more tax than us, the only two are USA and Switzerland. And remember as well, what was it about USA? It had more poverty. Other nations that are richer than us, Germany, Belgium, Austria, Denmark, Iceland, Netherlands, Norway, all richer than us, all raise more tax. There is no link between being a low tax nation and being wealthy. In fact, kind of the opposite. When you look at some of the nations down the other end of the scale, Colombia, Mexico, Costa Rica, Chile, Latvia, these are generally poor nations. They don't have also a lot of tax. So we can sort of just blow past that argument that you need to have low tax to encourage high income. That's completely untrue. So now we have to think, though, about solutions. What are we actually going to be advocating for? And the problem is, when you talk tax, people think, oh, God, you want more tax. You want to raise income tax. No, we do not want to raise income tax, because remember, the problem is not that we're a low taxing nation. The problem is we don't have enough revenue to provide those services. Because what do we want to do? We want to improve equality. We want to lower poverty. We want to provide better services. We want to improve the environment. Those are the things we want to do. The problem is we don't have enough revenue to do it. So it'd be pretty stupid to raise revenue in a way that is not going to improve equality, not going to lower poverty, not going to provide better public services, and not going to improve the environment. So what we've got is we've got a few more few ideas, and I see some people do have their hands raised. There will be plenty of time for questions afterwards, so don't feel like we're ignoring you or anything. So let's go with some solutions that we certainly are advocating. First, reduce the capital gains tax discount. Now, the capital gains tax discount is essentially a 50% discount on your income. Let's say you own a property, an investment property, and 5 years after you've bought it, you sell it for a nice, say, $500,000 profit, which unfortunately is probably not an exaggeration. In 2000, John Howard decided that you deserve to get 50% of that tax-free. So you get 250,000 tax-free, and you only have to pay tax on the other 250,000. In effect, in this instance, you've got a 250,000 tax-free threshold, rather higher than the actual $18,200 tax-free threshold. Problem with that, it costs a lot of money, $19.5 billion. Who gets that? The richest get it, unfortunately. It is an incredibly inequitable discount. 80% of that $19.5 billion goes to the richest 10% of people. And that equals about $15.5 billion. But again, if we put that out and say, oh, this looks really bad, and certainly it does shock people with things like that, doesn't seem all that fair. But it also feels like, oh, you're just hitting the rich. No. The reason why we want to get rid of the capital gains discount is because when John Howard introduced that in 2000, it massively distorted the housing market. Why? Because you suddenly had people who were able to invest in housing in a speculative way because their account was saying, hey, buy an investment property. You can negative gear it while you own it. And as soon as house prices go up, you can sell it and you're going to get a 50% discount on the income you make. That was just an amazing deal that, as you can see, contributed in a massive way to setting fire to the housing market, to the point where from 1970 to 2000, house prices basically went up in line with household incomes like it was meant to. Suddenly the capital gains tax discount was introduced. Housing became basically a speculator's market. It reduced affordability. So we're not just about reducing inequality and providing a fairer tax. We're actually about trying to fix the housing market. It's about trying to talk about what is the problem here. The problem actually isn't just that, oh, we've got this big capital gains discount. It's about, no, we want to fix the housing market. And obviously, we want to use that $19.5 billion to help provide better services. Another one, superannuation incentives. Now, we've had superannuation, compulsory superannuation, for basically 3 decades now. And when it was brought in, you actually the government wanted to encourage people to save. Why? Because the whole purpose of superannuation is to get people off the age pension, that you're able to save for yourself so that when you retire, you actually don't need the age pension. You've got a good superannuation fund. You're okay. And that reduces the burden on the government. Problem is, think about how you access those incentives, from contributing money to your super, salary sacrificing, putting money in at the end and claiming a tax discount. You actually need to have money to be able to do that. You need to be able to have spare money. Who's got the spare money? Again, wealthiest people. About 50% of it goes to the richest 10%, which in the last financial year, Treasury estimates was about $26.3 billion in foregone revenue. Now, we're not saying get rid of that completely. It is good that you encourage people to save. But again, think about what we're trying to do. We were trying to help get people off the age pension. If you're someone in the richest 10%, you're someone who has got probably over $1 million in super. You're earning close to around 180 to 200,000. You were never going to be eligible for the age pension. The age pension has asset tests. It has income tests. So what's happening is where these tax concessions aren't actually helping people get off the pension, it's helping people who are never going to be on the pension pay less tax. And that seems to be a rather skewed public policy. So it's not about that. And if you think, okay, but we're still hitting the rich and, all that, again, remember, we've been doing this for 30 years or so. And go back to that poverty rate of people in retirement. Only the Baltic nations, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia have higher ones than us, and Korea. This is not a success. This is not what success looks like of a retirement policy where we are giving $26 billion in tax breaks to the richest 10%, while we have one of the highest levels of retirement age poverty in the advanced world. We're a rich nation with high degrees of poverty. Unfortunately, we've got a retirement policy that is helping make rich people richer. So, a third one, eliminate fossil fuel subsidies that cost about $14.5 billion. We've done some research here at the Oz Institute, and about $14.5 billion in subsidies are going to fossil fuel companies. Now, I could go through all of them, but let's just pick one, and that is the fuel tax credit, which is a credit to companies and businesses who are notionally not using the roads, and so they get a tax credit. Problem is that this is a credit that is essentially, and we're talking diesel here really, subsidizing the consumption of fossil fuels, which contribute to greenhouse gases. And a lot of it, most of it, is actually going to fossil fuel producers who are also contributing to greenhouse gases. So we're actually kind of incentivizing people to keep, or companies to keep using diesel and to keep using fossil fuels. Now, whenever we raise this sense of, oh, you're trying to hurt mining, you're trying to make mining unprofitable, we give massive amounts of fuel tax credits to these companies. In coal mining, it was nearly $1 billion. Metal ore mining, 1.2 billion. Other non-metallic minerals, nearly half a bit, or just a touch over $500 million, which sounds like a lot of money, and certainly is if you're trying to help fund aged care. But if you're a coal miner, it's a pittance compared to the nearly $22 billion in profit, or the $28.7 billion you made if you're an oil and gas company. Removing these subsidies will not send these companies to the wall, does not make them unprofitable. It actually works in the public interest. And think about this as well. This is not just us saying, it's us nice greenies. The OECD, which is currently being run by Matthias Cormann, who some of you might remember was former Liberal finance minister, they put out a report this year talking about how can we transition to net zero here in Australia. And one of the things they highlighted was the existing fuel tax credits are expensive and limit the incentives to reduce fuel use. They actually, not, I would argue, they actually incentivize using fuel use, and they argued that we should consider reducing the generosity of the fuel tax credits. We here at the Oz Institute are perhaps a bit more progressive, and we say actually remove the generosity completely. But even just the use of that term generosity just shows, yeah, we're being very generous to very wealthy, very profitable companies who are actually in a way that is actually worsening greenhouse gases. So that's something we could go to. Another one, and this, we stick with the gas industry, increase the charges for the gas industry. Now, more than half of Australia's gas exports, so this is kind of a bit of a surprise to most people, pays zero royalties. And we had the question about royalties before. Some people might not know what royalties are. Royalties are essentially the price you pay, companies pay to state governments, and mostly we're talking West Australia and Queensland, but even South Australia as well, and others, but mostly West Australia and Queensland, to be able to mine those minerals. Because if you're an iron ore company, you want the iron ore that we've got in our ground. Well, that's Australian ground. That's Western Australian ground. That's Queensland ground. We own that. That is our resources. And once it's taken out of the ground, it's gone. So you've got to pay a cost. It's a little bit like a builder paying for the cost of their bricks. It is something that they need to get so that they can sell it. We're charging you for that. But here's the weird thing. If you are a gas company that works offshore, say the Gorgon project, you don't have to pay a royalty. You're royalty free. We're giving you our gas for free. And here's the other thing. If you are, for example, in Queensland, getting some gas through fracking that is then being sent off for LNG, you might have to pay the royalty, but you don't have to pay the petroleum resources rent tax. So gas companies are sort of winning both ways. And also the problem with the petroleum resources rent tax is there is many ways to get away from it, many ways to avoid it. The Gorgon project, one of the largest LNG projects in the world, does not expect to pay any petroleum resources rent. We've been able to do some research that suggests if we had a stronger PRRT, we'd be able to raise about $2.5 billion extra a year. And if the royalties, those gas companies in Western Australia that don't pay any royalties on their gas at the moment, our research has shown that in just WA alone, they'd be able to raise about $2.5 billion as well in royalties. And these are just some of the figures there. And a key one to note, Qatar produces about half as much oil and gas as we do, but they get 6 times the amount of revenue that we do. Half as much oil and gas produced, 6 times the revenue. This is always what we say. Places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, all that, when they hear that gas prices are going up, that petrol prices and oil prices are going up, they celebrate because they're going to get more revenue. Here, we complain because we know we're actually not going to get more revenue. We're all just going to be hurt from it. Also, and this is one of the other things, compare how much they're paying on things to what others are doing. We know that smokers, university grads who are paying HEX, spirit drinkers who are paying spirits excise, beer drinkers who are paying beer excise, people applying for visas, each year all pay more tax than gas companies do. The gas companies that are making billions in profits. So it's about sort of providing that. It's just about fairness, but it's also about actually getting a return on resources that once they're taken, they're not coming back. Finally, there are other methods we could be looking at. Ross Garneau earlier this year pointed out that if we just kept in place the ETS that Julia Gillard brought in and Tony Abbott got rid of, we'd be raising $70 billion a year more in revenue. $70 billion. That's a lot of money that could be used to help transition to net zero, to build renewable energy projects, to assist with the retraining, assist with the help of people who are in affected industries. And yet Tony Abbott decided, no, we don't need that revenue. We could also do things like wealth taxes. These are a bit harder to estimate how much money, and it's not just sort of socialist communist countries that have them. Right this moment, Kamala Harris is proposing a wealth tax, from memory, 28% on the unrealized capital gains of people with shareholdings and the like of more than $100 million. So you can raise the bar really high to say we're only going to affect the richest 0.1% of people. At the moment, we're not doing that. So these are the type of solutions we can advocate for. We can actually say we've got a problem. We're not raising much tax. Why is that a problem? Because it means we're not able to provide the services that we need in education, in health, in reducing poverty. Here are some ways we can go about fixing it. Now, if we put all these together, and we wouldn't get all of for example, the 51.6 billion, we'd probably get a lot less than that. But even these things together don't get us close to that 140 billion dollars I was talking about. I'm not saying we're immediately going to raise $140 billion and get us close to where Canada is, but saying that there is a case to be made that we need to raise more tax. Now, very quickly at the end, there's always these responsive arguments. Whenever you hear about, oh, we need to raise more tax, you'll always hear the Business Council of Australia and other organisations say, oh, yes, we need more GST, because a lot of those countries in the OECD, yes, they do raise more GST. But again, go back to what is the problem we're trying to fix? We're trying to fix inequality. We're trying to fix high degrees of poverty. If we raise the GST, who would that hurt? Low and middle income people. So basically, we'd be raising the GST just so we can give more money to people who are living in poverty so they can basically stay exactly where they are right now. Not a really effective way of doing it. But if people would keep going on about GST, you can say, okay, well, we at this moment don't raise GST on private health insurance. We don't raise GST on private education. We know that the people who spend the most of their income on private health insurance and on private education are richer people. So if we were to raise GST on those, or to place GST on those two things, not only would it raise around $9.5 billion, according to the Treasury, but it actually would be a progressive tax because it would not hurt people on lower middle income earners as much as wealthier people who can actually afford it. Then you always get the line, taxes are unpopular. Yeah, they are. Income tax is really unpopular. But just remember as well, the stage 3 changes that the government put in place actually effectively raised tax for people earning over $150,000 a year, which seems quite incredible that a government was saying, we're going to raise tax on people. And yet it was so popular that the opposition dumped their opposition to it within a day. Why? Because the government was able to say the problem is this tax, this stage 3 is inequitable. That's going to not help poverty. It's not going to help people on low incomes. These things that with this new stage 3 is actually going to solve that problem. And with these things as well, yes, tax might be unpopular, but you know what's popular? Public services, better schools, lower wait times for emergency rooms, better infrastructure, better roads, transitioning to renewable energies. These are all popular things, but they require revenue to do them. So let's raise that revenue in a way that's not going to hurt lower middle income people. And then, of course, the old chestnut, oh, this is going to hurt productivity, this is going to hurt aspiration. No, as I've shown, there's no link between less tax, more productivity, or more wealth, or more income. Actually, kind of the reverse, but there definitely is a link between less tax and more poverty and less overall happiness in society. And I'll end you with the line that we often push. Richard Dennis, our executive director, always likes saying, tax is good. It is the price we pay to live in a society. So we need to think about what type of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a low tax but high poverty, high inequitable, low government services, terrible public schools, long waiting times? Or do we want to live in a society that actually, yes, it might raise a bit more tax, about the same amount of tax as Canada and New Zealand, God help us, and actually have better services, less inequality. We don't have retirees living in poverty. We have a better, fairer society. That's what the ball game is about. And hopefully, just in this talk, I've been able to give you some tips that help you advocate for that point. But certainly, I know there are going to be plenty of questions about it, so I'm happy to take them. Thank you very much for listening. I hope all the spreadsheets haven't put you off, but as we have said, there will be PDF slides of them, so you can go through in a bit slower detail. And I'm very happy now to take any more questions. Thank you, everybody.
We do have a lot of questions. There's one here from Andrew Korekes. I hope I didn't mangle that too awfully. Asking mentioning the value of the fourth estate and asking what is the quickest path to changing the narrative in the broader population?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that we think about. And a good example is to think of that stage 3 taxes. By the time we got to sort of about October last year, everyone in journalism, and I was certainly talking to my colleagues at The Guardian, they were all like, nah, the stage 3 it's set in stone. They're never going to dump it. And we were like, well, actually, if we come up with a different way, if we provide the solution, show them not only is this expensive, not only is it unfair, but actually you could rejig it in a way that is fair, would cost the same amount or even cost less. Suddenly that provided an option. Actually, we had, the Murdoch Press, news.com were running it quite strongly because they're like, wow, this actually seems good. Why isn't the government doing it? So you're actually able to provide sometimes that solution, that option that has them being able to say, okay, Prime Minister, okay, Treasury, why aren't you doing this? This seems like something that would be good. Force the government to actually have to answer the question of why they're choosing not to do it. And a good way to get that, this question's asked, is to provide them, in a sense, to the journalists who don't have the time, don't have the skills to actually come up with these options, but to say, actually, if you raised the level, if we took or reduced the capital gains discount, that would provide us with enough money to perhaps raise the age pension or raise job seeker by this amount. Why aren't you doing it? That is a very good way, an effective way we've found of kind of changing the questions that journalists are asking and forcing them in a way to ask questions of politicians that they perhaps don't want to ask because they don't want to reveal that actually they have a choice. Governments have a choice. Every budget, the government is choosing what it wants to put an emphasis on, what it wants to fund, what it wants to not fund. And they even write it out and put it down on a big page and make a speech about it. So let's force them to confront those choices and realize that actually they could choose better.
Tony Robertson, you've been waiting patiently. We'll come to you if you're still there after this question. Alex Bishop and Matthew Thompson were both asking questions about political lobbying and what kind of factor this is in terms of trying to make changes to taxes. Can you comment a bit on these sorts of issues?
Yeah, look, I think sometimes people think that lobbying is all about, oh, I got a meeting with the minister and I was able to talk to someone. And to be honest, sometimes the minister is meeting with you because he knows that's pretty much all you were after. And it was like, yes, we had a wonderful meeting, and did you actually affect them to do anything? And this is why we certainly think the change comes from, one, affecting the public, getting the public voice out there. And you think about, again, I go back to the stage 3. The change came from the ground up. The public hated the stage 3 tax cuts, and the more they heard about them, the less they liked them, the more they hated them. And so we made sure that as many people as possible knew about them. Same with things like negative gearing and capital gains tax, which always seem, oh, they're political death. Well, they're not actually very popular, but it's a case of we have to sometimes, you have to kind of, when we say providing a solution, you're almost helping the government across the road. We'll hold your hand and get you across the road. We will show that there is cover for you, that it's not popular, that if you do this, it will be popular in these areas, that there are these organizations. This is where NGOs are very important, getting NGOs together, building up a bit of a confederation or a grouping that say, actually, we will come out and support you when you do these things. It might be and the same thing with stage 3. They didn't do exactly what we said, but they made it very good. So we weren't going to bash them for not doing exactly what we wanted them to do. They had done a very good thing. So we supported for them. And it's that sense of working, getting the message across that here are the things you can do. Here is why it will be popular. Here are the things you can, that you can advocate and sell. And here's your message. And here's the instance of knowing that we've kind of got you back, rather than just, oh, the key to lobbying is actually to get your foot in the door. Quite often it's not. Quite often just getting to talk to a minister, is just getting to talk to a minister and they can tick that box, and it's not all that effective.
There've been a few.
Is that Tony Robertson still there?
He says that his question's been answered, so I believe he's satisfied.
Oh, that's wonderful.
We have a few people commenting on the GST and what kind of role that plays in an equitable society.
Yeah, see, it's when we look at a lot of those OECD nations that have a high degree of tax, a lot of that they do have high GST. And the way they counter that is with massive government subsidies towards people in low and middle income. So it's almost a case of those arguing, oh, raise GST. It's like, so you're saying we got to raise GST to hurt people on lower middle incomes more so that then we can provide more services to them just to keep them where they are. Whereas I advocate, hang on, we're actually providing masses, as I said, $15.5 billion each year in capital gains discount going to the richest 10%. These are people who are essentially earning more than $180,000. And the government at this moment is choosing, you know what, those people who are earning $180,000 and who have got investment properties, they deserve a $15.5 billion tax cut, or tax break, I should say. Now, I would argue Well, instead of doing a GST that is kind of going to take money, hurt poor people so that when we can help poor people and keep them sane, let's actually reduce the amount of money we're giving to people who actually don't need it and who we're giving it to them in a way that is distorting the housing market. And we can say that unequivocally because we know as soon as the capital gains discount came in, negative gearing shot off. Before the capital gains discount came in 2000, the amount of people who negative geared and positive geared, so basically were getting a profit on their investment property, was basically the same, exactly the same. After the discount, the amount of positively geared properties, the amount of people who had an investment property and were making a bit of a profit, that stayed exactly the same, didn't really go up or down. But the amount of people who were suddenly negative gearing, that shot up. It pretty much doubled within a decade. And the reason being was as soon as it came in, negative gearing suddenly became a profitable activity for your accountant to argue you should do because they could say, hey, invest, buy this property, bet that it's going to go up in value, so speculate. And while you're waiting for it to go up in value, you can negative gear and reduce your taxes. So you can reduce your tax while you've got this property. And then when it goes up in value, you can sell it and then reduce your tax. So it became a game changer in the industry. So, that whole line about, oh, you got to raise GST, that's the key. It's like, but what are we trying to solve? What is the problem we're trying to solve? The problem we're trying to solve is to lower poverty, reduce inequality, provide better government services. Raising the GST is not going to reduce inequality. It's not going to um, help people get out of poverty. Yes, it might raise more money that we can provide for government services, but first we're going to have to undo the damage that it's been done in reducing poverty and reducing inequality. So that's actually kind of, I think, a very inefficient way to do it. Much better tax gas companies who have got masses of money who aren't even paying for the gas that they're giving. We're giving them their gas for free that they're then selling to Japan, who are then selling it to other places because they've got so much gas from, let's be honest, the Japanese companies that are getting gas out of Australia, and we're giving it to them for free, which is just madness. I mean, could you imagine if you're in the construction industry and you're a builder and you're saying, oh, yeah, I'm making heaps of profit. And one of the great things about it is I'm not even paying for my bricks. And you'd be like, that seems a good way to make a lot of profit. We're saying, how about you pay for your bricks, pay for your gas, do things like that. Superannuation, why are we giving these tax breaks to people who've got $3 million in super who are saying, oh, I need my super so I can give it to my grandchildren? It's like, no, that's not the reason why we gave you a tax break. We gave you a tax break so you wouldn't have to be reliant on the age pension, not just so that the very richest in Australia can pay less tax, can avoid paying tax. That's not the public policy goal. So it's always about that. I don't mind the fight on GST. I'm very happy to have that because I also say, hey, we don't tax private school fees. And we know who's going to King's College. We know who's going to Geelong Grammar. These are not poor people. Same with private health insurance. We're basically subsidizing private health because for some reason we decided that private health insurance and private health is better than actually delivering a better public health system. It all goes back to who sort of brought in all these, who made all these decisions. John Howard, the current government and government since then have chosen to keep them in place. We argue maybe that's a bad choice.
Hmm. I think we just have time for one last question. So this is from Kate Crawford. Would increasing revenue from fossil fuels become an incentive for government to encourage delays in a transition away from fossil fuel?
No, I think it actually would do the opposite. I think actually, one of these the things that we always like saying is tax the things you want less of and subsidize the things you want more of. We want more people in public health. We want better schools. We want more people out of poverty. We want less greenhouse gas emissions. So let's tax those greenhouse gas emissions. The reality is, they're very profitable at the moment. And if we raise tax and they say, oh, well, we'll keep them in the ground, well, then we're like, well, good. Now it's a little bit like the argument about smoking and saying that that we always had back in the day that if we raise the tax on smoking, then that kind of prevents us, will become too addicted to the revenue on tax from smokers. One, it's not going to drive them away straight away. We should actually be taxing them now, because they are going to eventually have to stop mining these fossil fuels. They are going to have to stop using coal-fired power stations and even gas-fired, or at least the level of gas that they're doing right now. What we should be doing is making them pay for the transition that we're having to do because of their product. They are the ones who are making a profit out of something that is ruining our climate and forcing us to have to upheave our entire economy and cause stress on people's lives. They should have to pay for it. And hopefully we can transition in such a way that we actually don't need as much of their revenue as it is, because we're already transitioned. And also, we should go back and remember, mining is not a major contributor to our revenue. They always like saying they are. Across the entire state and federal governments, and this includes royalties and everything, mining companies contribute about 3% of all revenue. That includes income tax, company tax, GST, royalties, everything. Every year, they're about 3%. And oil and gas are a minute amount of that, even, because they pay bugger all. So forcing oil and gas companies to actually pay a fair share of their tax, one, we're not going to become addicted to it, because it's not a massive amount of tax, really, but it is that extra bit of tax that actually will enable us to transition, and also just help people get out of poverty, provide better services, better infrastructure, and all the good things that actually are popular.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Greg. That was an excellent first episode of Policy School. And thank you to everyone for coming along and for your thoughtful engagement and questions. We look forward to seeing you next time, when webinar is on the 3rd of October, and we'll be discussing how parliaments share power when no one party has majority control. That'll be with Bill Brown. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube to catch all of our webinars. You can also subscribe to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. And if you're in Sydney, be sure to secure your tickets to see Jose Ramos Horta speak at the Sydney Opera House. You can find information about that on our website. If you have any follow-up questions, or if you have any feedback, as we said, this is our first episode, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us. That would be mail@australiainstitute.org.au. And please put Policy School as the subject. Thanks so much for coming. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. See you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.